Hi, Tab Colorado. My name is Sydney Snyder, and I am an art educator in Los Angeles. I am honored to have been invited to share a presentation that I created for the Adding Voices conference this past June called Queer Visibility in the Elementary and Middle School Art Classroom. This is a previously recorded presentation. Since that conference, I've begun working with the founder, Flavia Zuniga West, to create curriculum resources and newsletters that you can find on the Adding Voices Patreon. But I'm excited to share this presentation with you all. I hope you find it helpful. I'm doing a Q&A during this conference to answer any questions you might have or talk through experiences that you've had that you might need some thoughts on. I've also done a bunch of stuff this fall during distance learning that I could have added to the presentation, but it's so long already that I'm kind of leaving it as is, but maybe I can share some of that new information with you during the Q&A. So if you find this helpful, please join me for one of the Q&A sessions, and I look forward to seeing you. Thank you so much for joining me today. I'm so excited that you want to know more about adding the voices of LGBTQIA+ artists to your curriculum and more about creating a safe and inclusive space for all of your students. This is a beast of a topic. So please see this as a small start. I hope I'm able to provide you some new information and motivation to get started, and hopefully some actionable items that you can do right away and resources to learn more as I am after this presentation. Thank you so much. My name is Sydney Snyder. My pronouns are she, her, hers. I am an artist and art educator living in Los Angeles, California. I've been teaching for around 9 years, and I've been teaching at my current school, Chime Charter, for about 5 years now. To give you some context, my school is in the San Fernando Valley in Los Angeles, and it is a fully inclusive school, which means that our students of all physical and intellectual abilities learn side by side all day. There are no pullouts or special day classes. I wanted to start with this quote by an artist that I will be sharing with you later in this presentation named Daniel Arzola. Oops, I made a mistake. The artist name is actually pronounced Daniel Arzola. I am going to say his name a couple more times throughout this presentation. I just wanted you to know that it is pronounced Daniel, so when you share his work with your own students, you can pronounce it correctly. Sorry about that. He said, many people grow up without being able to feel positively represented. That makes the process of building your identity even more difficult. This is why visibility is so important in all subjects and in the art room. Our students need to see themselves in the art and artists we share to help build their own identity. So I have found that when it's safe and comfortable to do so, and I acknowledge that it isn't always safe to do so, it can help to share your personal story. So I'd like to share my personal story with you. I identify as queer spawn, or the child of a queer parent. My father, Lauren Snyder, is a transgender woman, and she came out several years ago at 66. And conveniently, my dad's an artist, so it's been easy to share her work and make talking about my family relevant with my students. There are other ways to share your stories, sharing your pronouns, even if you're cisgender, displaying family photos, a sticker or sign or indication that you're an ally. And you do not have to identify as queer to create a safe space for your students. This is really important. Including LGBTQIA+ identifying artists in your curriculum shows students that you see them and they're included and helps them feel heard. And that promotes inclusive and empathy building dialogue. And that's really important. I want to include this quote by Mr. Lyon, who's a 4th grade teacher, and I recommend you follow him. It shouldn't always be the queer teacher's job to advocate for LGBTQ content. Whether you're an ally or want to become an ally and learn more, it's going to take all of us to ensure that curriculum is inclusive, and it shouldn't fall on our educators of color and queer educators to advocate for inclusivity. It's on all of us. These are some things I have around my classroom, and the big thing is including queer artists in your curriculum, but it can help if you identify yourself as an ally. So I'm at a charter school that has some connection to LAUSD, and LAUSD has had a program called Out for Safe Schools for a number of years now, and we were just given resources to help make our school a more inclusive space. So they gave us badges so that we could put our pronouns on a button and a tag that we could choose to add to our keychain to identify ourselves as an ally, posters and other resources. And I know GLSEN also has a safe space kit that you can purchase. And I've also included some of the resources that LAUSD provided us in the folder of resources that you will get with this presentation. I know that nowadays most of us are probably not teaching our students in our normal art studio and classroom, and it is possible to create an inclusive space in the digital world. This is kind of a silly example, but I know a lot of people now are making Bitmoji classrooms. So I went ahead and created a poster to add to my classroom, and this is something I'm also including in the resources. There's a few different versions of this. So just putting up a little sign to show that you're a safe person and it's an inclusive space, even in the digital sphere, can be helpful. Okay, so I'd love to talk about LGBTQIA+ inclusive curriculum in the elementary art classroom. Here I have a couple of examples of art created by some of my 5th graders who are in my 5th grade drawing club. Thought they were good examples. This was not part of a project. I actually teach in a TAB classroom, so teaching for artistic behavior. All of our lessons are choice-based, so students are choosing what they want to make art about and what they want to make art with. And it's really cool because you get art like this where you can see into your students' world and see what's important to them and their view of the world. I think a big stumbling block when it comes to bringing queer artists into the elementary art room is people worry about age-appropriate language. And since you are not a science or sexuality ed teacher, you likely won't be diving too deeply into discussions about LGBTQ+ issues outside of, giving context to art and the artists themselves. You will need to be ready to respond to questions and comments by students, so it's good to be prepared and think ahead. These are all kind of examples of conversations I've had and things that have been said in my classroom and at my school. So with our younger students especially, it's important to give examples that have meaning for them, that are within their schema. And so a good way to do that is to talk about the family and to talk about parents. So something we say like in TK, which is transitional kindergarten before kindergarten, is there are all different kinds of families. You have a mom and dad, and Javier has 2 dads. How cool is that? And of course, you're never going to out a child or their family. If this is known information and information that a family shared, and it comes up, then of course you can help a child make a connection between their family and another family. I've also said things like some families have 1 mom and 1 dad, some families have 2 moms, some families have no moms. Keeping it simple is also really helpful. So I'm going to tell you in a minute about when I shared my personal story with my kindergartners, and it's really helpful to keep things simple. So I'll share more, but yes, most dads are boys, but some dads are girls like mine, and you will be surprised. Students are not born with the biases that we walk around with. They're blank slates, and we're here to educate them. And it's much easier to have a conversation with a 5-year-old about my transgender parent than it is most adults. And then this came up during a lesson of mine. A student said, a girl can't love another girl. And I simply just responded with, of course they can. A girl can love a boy, a girl, no one at all. So you are clear, you state facts, you help students make personal connections. I wanted to tell you a little bit about an experience I had where I shared my personal story with my kindergarten students, because I think um, it's a great example of how easy it is for young kids to wrap their heads around things that are not as easy for us adults. So last year, my father turned 70, and I was going to fly to Santa Fe, where my dad lives, to surprise her for her birthday. Unfortunately, this meant that I was going to miss a class with my kindergarten students. So I told them that I was missing the class, and I told them why I was missing the class, and they asked me to tell them about my dad, and I used my dad's pronouns, which are she, her, hers, and of course, the students, most of them expressed some confusion. And I told them that my dad's an artist, and they asked to see a picture. So I showed the students my picture, and they said, dads can't have long hair. And I said, oh, well, my dad does. But dads are boys. Well, my dad is a girl, but most dads are boys. And most students, it was awesome. Most students just got it, just said like, oh, okay. After answering a couple of questions and telling the students about my dad, they immediately started asking if they could make my dad birthday cards. And this ended up happening in most of my 4 kindergarten classes that day. So they sat down and got to work, and I was able to bring my dad all of these sweet cards for my kindergartners when I went out. This stayed on the minds of the kindergartners for a couple of weeks. I shared this photo with them, and for weeks after that, my students would walk up to my desk and proudly hand me some artwork, and I'd say, oh, thank you, should I put this on my bulletin board? And they'd say, that's not for you, that's for your dad. Duh. So the sweetest example, or the example that really meant the most to me was I had a kindergarten student walk up to me with this little red piece of paper, and it was folded in half, and she opened it up and she said, this is for your dad. And I looked at it, and there was a drawing of a stick figure looking sad, and it said the word bad, and a stick figure looking happy, kind of dancing with a dress on, and it said good. And so I asked her what it meant, and she said, well, this is your dad when people say that she can't be a girl and that she can't be herself, and that's bad. And this is your dad just being herself, and that's good because she's happy. And it took, as you can imagine, everything in me not to just burst into tears in that moment, because these words in this drawing from a kindergartner made me feel more safe at my school. I knew that she had thought about this a lot, and the way she processed it, it was so simple. And I think that's what you'll find with your youngest students when you share queer artists. It's easier to have these conversations with children than it is to have these conversations with adults a lot of the time. Okay, so here is a project that I do with 3rd grade every year. This project is based off of a series called Monday Hearts for Madeline by an artist named Paige Hodel. And this lesson I do every February, which at my school is Kindness Month. And the big question I ask is, can you show kindness through art, and how? And we spend a lot of classes during that month beautifying our school and showing acts of kindness through art. And this is kind of the finale of all of that. So this series is by an artist who began making these hearts for her partner, Madeline, to surprise her and brighten her day. She'd go out to her doorstep on Sunday night or early Monday morning and create these elaborate hearts, so that when Madeline opened her door in the morning, she'd see this beautiful thing that was created for her. And it was just like a lovely way to start her week. Unfortunately, Madeline passed away just a few months into their relationship, and Paige continued creating these hearts. She found out that Madeline expressed to her that this series had that these acts had meant so much to her and made such a difference for her. And so Paige promised that she would continue creating these after she was gone, and she has. And you can go to her website, I'll share it with you, and there are at this point, like, I think thousands of images of hearts, and people all around the world have joined this project. I am including a link to the presentation that I use, and it has a video interview with the artist Paige Hodel about this series, and you're welcome to use that in your classroom. Here are just a few examples of these hearts, and as you can imagine, the students love seeing these photos. They love identifying what objects have been used. When I pull up her website, they always ask me to just show more and more and more and more and more, and this is just such a small sample. I highly recommend you go to the website, Monday Hurts for Madeline, and check it out. And then these are, this is from this February, some examples of what my students worked on. So I usually put out a bunch of different items, and we work on composition and photography, and they do not create collages that go home with them. They create composition that they then photograph. I think it's important to note here that, so I do this with third graders, and talking about death with third grade, death and dying is, can be tricky. And I had, like, this student became very emotional. She had lost her grandparent. Every year I have a few students who get emotional, which is completely understandable. And I know probably the first 20 times I watched the video, I cried. So it, you know, we're human. And that's what we talk about. We talk about that we can feel really sad when we lose someone, and we affirm our students' feelings and experiences. And I have students share that they have lost pets, that they have lost parents, that they've lost grandparents, that they have friends who've lost parents. And this gives students an opportunity to create something in memory of those people. So this student ended up creating something for her grandparent. And like I said, I'm in a choice-based classroom, so this was a choice, and I had so many students choose to participate. I had students make hearts for themselves. I had students make hearts for people who are alive. But because we talk about death, we like to send out a notice to parents ahead of time. So this is the email. We just started sending this year, although I've been doing the project for a couple of years. And it's really short and simple. And I just link parents to the series and the videos that I'm showing. And if they choose to look at it in advance, they can. And if they don't, but their child comes home with questions or wants to talk about it at home, they have those resources and can access those then. Before we started sending out that email, I actually got an email from a parent that was a long email that she sent to her child's classroom teacher and then was forwarded to me. This email came as a huge surprise. This was a parent that had volunteered in my classroom a lot, that I felt like I knew really well. And this was the first time I had heard anything from a parent in response to this project that wasn't just really positive. And I included a short excerpt here from the email that says, while we are staunchly liberal and totally support the LGBTQ community, we don't feel that third grade is the appropriate age to begin exploring this topic, especially at school without us. I wanted to check in with you and see why the school would deem this story about sexuality, any sexuality, regardless of gender preference, age appropriate. This was like one of those floor falls out from underneath you situations where, you know, everything goes black. And I printed out the email and I brought it to my administrators right away and had a meeting with them and one of my coworkers, and I immediately knew that they had my back and they were on the same page as me, which was really empowering. I know that that is not going to be the case for all educators, unfortunately, who encounter pushback when they're creating inclusive curriculum, which again is why it's important to identify yourself as an ally within your school community. But this was a really hard experience, and I'm fortunate to say that this was the only email like this that I've ever received. But I learned a lot from it, and I feel that it's valuable to share this because you're not the first one to experience this kind of pushback. And I hope that something I learned from it can help you if you face a similar situation. What I walked away with is that first, you have to let yourself feel the feelings. Let the room go black or red or whatever color you're seeing when you read something that hits a nerve like that. And if you're able to reach out to allies at school, whether it's administrators or fellow coworkers, or go home to your family and talk about it, I think that's really important to process your feelings. I ended up, my administrators wanted me to have a conversation with the parent that day, and I did. And I walked away from it wishing that it had been a face-to-face conversation, though I think at that point I was not ready for that. The conversation basically ended with the parent saying, well, then we're going to have to agree to disagree. I think this was inappropriate. So I went home and I slept on it. And by slept on it, I mean woke up every hour and wrote down my feelings about the situation and thoughts I had, because I knew in the morning I was going to email this parent to say that I wanted to meet with her before the end of the week to discuss the situation and hear what she has to say and share some more information about the lesson, because I feel like maybe she doesn't have all the information. So I slept on it. And then I emailed the parent and I said at this meeting, and she responded saying that she was so grateful that I wanted to talk about it more, because she also didn't feel like things ended the way she'd like them to. And because I knew that I had the support of my family at home and my coworkers at school, and I live in the state of California, where we were actually the first state in the United States to require the LGBTQ plus individuals are included in curriculum. So I knew that I had laws backing me up. I, in this privileged position, was able to go in to the meeting and listen with empathy. And this is something that's not easy to do, but we also know as teachers that often when we hear any kind of pushback or negative feedback from parents, the big thing we can do that they're asking for is just to be heard. So I was able to sit down and listen, with my notepad, knowing what I was going to say next. And after I heard her concerns, I was able to respond to them, citing facts, helping her make the same connections that I help my students make, and using examples that are in her that, experience. So I went into the meeting with all my notes, and I wish so badly that I had had this amazing resource that I'm about to share with you. So this is from GLSEN's Developing an LGBTQ Inclusive Classroom resource, and I'm going to link to this later in the presentation. This is from the section Advocacy, Addressing Questions and Pushback. And it says, students of all ages must be given an opportunity to learn that the words gay, lesbian, and transgender are adjectives that should be used with respect to describe people in their community, not words used in a negative way to hurt, insult, and degrade. I think this sums it up perfectly. They actually have a lot of talking points in this resource. This was a big thing that I was trying to convey to this parent, is that I did not teach, I didn't do it as an art teacher, I didn't do a lesson on sex ed. That's not in my scope of practice. I simply taught about an artist who happens to be gay and gave context to her piece, really necessary context, and shared that she has a same-sex partner. And then here are some of those laws that I was able to cite. So if you're in California, these are great resources. My school actually uses these national sexuality education standards. Not every school does use these. These aren't like the core standards that are widely accepted, but these have little milestones in them, like by the end of second grade, students should be able to identify different kinds of family structures. So I was able to share these with her, and this was new to her. And I think a big problem that kept coming up was that the parent was saying she didn't have any connection to this issue. She didn't have any connections. And I ended the meeting by saying, it sounds like it's time to make some new friends and to meet some new people and to bring some new people into her kids' lives, because there are amazing members of our community who identify as queer openly. And it sounds like she needs to broaden her circle. I also shared with her that I share my personal story with kindergartners and that they know that my father is transgender. And that's when she looked like the floor fell out from beneath her. And I didn't do this to make her feel like that, but I did want her to understand that this was personal for me and that she does know someone that this directly impacts. And she, went completely pale and apologized. And I think it did give the situation new meaning for her because she was indirectly saying that it would be inappropriate to talk about my family. And I let her know that it is not. And after that, we were able to have respectful conversations, and I walked away from it feeling pretty good. And I think she walked away from it feeling good. And I think it was a valuable experience for both of us. I learned how to have this conversation and I learned how to listen. And she also learned how to listen and to maybe think about things in a way that she hadn't before. As I mentioned, I'm lucky enough to live in a state where I have laws backing me up. And I know that that is not true for everyone. In fact, I know that some states have what is called a no promo homo law, which actually prohibits teaching about, in certain contexts, queer individuals in a positive light. And there's more information on that here if you want to read about it. It's always good to know the laws and policies in your state, but I highly recommend checking out these resources on this website because there's language in these laws that gets misconstrued and prevents teachers like you and I from teaching about diverse artists, and it's actually misinterpretation of the text and policies. So read it over, know what's safe for you to share, and once again, identify yourself as an ally in your own school so that when your coworkers are in this position, they know that if they don't have the backing of the administrators, if they don't have the backing of laws and the protection of laws, that they have someone else that can help them and support them when they run into pushback like I did. And now I have some more artists that you can share with your students. All of these artists are great for middle school as well. And not all the work by all of these artists is going to be appropriate for elementary school. So elementary school students. So you will have to use your best judgment on what artwork you show students. And obviously there are a lot more artists than this. This is just kind of a starting point. And I'd love any recommendations from anyone. So you're always welcome to email me with more. So now we're going to move into LGBTQIA+ inclusive curriculum in the middle school classroom. And this poster here is from a unit that myself and the other art teacher at my school, Emily Morton, did with our students this year on art and activism. And at the start of the unit, I put up a poster in my classroom. You can see this particular group of students really, LGBTQ+ issues are very important to them. And what they put here informed what we included in the unit. So this is just kind of the first slide of the presentation, and I'm happy to share the presentation in its entirety with anyone who's interested, but I wanted to share some artists from our LGBTQ section with you. So the first artist I wanted to tell you about that I shared a quote from earlier is Daniel Arzola. He is an artist and activist, or an artivist, from Venezuela who makes activist work to raise awareness on issues that he himself has faced as a queer individual living in a country that, if you can imagine, is even less accepting than our own. And his work was we tried sharing some work by artists that I'm going to share with you in a couple minutes that was more abstract. And we found that this work, that with the color and with these statements, was work that the students really connected to. It was a lot more black and white and just more accessible to them. This series is called I Am Not a Joke, because one of the problems that he notices is that when queer people in Venezuela show up in the media, it's either like in a hateful way, as the butt of a joke, or it's never in a positive light. So His series is called I Am Not a Joke. My students connected with this work so much. We had incredible discussions after it. I heard from students who almost never raised their hands. So this is an artist I highly recommend sharing with middle school. Another artist our middle schoolers were really able to connect to was Lee Pahe, and she is a Filipino artist. And she makes work about the complexity of gender and queer visibility. And one of the big reasons they could connect is because she has a whole series that uses recognizable Disney characters and kind of recontextualizes their identities and relationships, which they found interesting. She also creates family portraits of just traditional domestic scenes, but with same-sex couples to promote visibility and normalize queer families. We shared the work of Zachary Drucker and Reese Ernst, specifically their relationship series with the students. I had also promised I would share my dad, Lauren's work with students. And so I shared the work of these artists and my dad with them. And this series, while really powerful, they connected with it, but it wasn't as easy as, they didn't connect as easily as they did with the work by the previous two artists. I think just because of maybe the medium, and this series is really about visibility and documenting a transition in a relationship. And at least the work of Daniel Arzola is overtly activist work. But they were able to make some connections to it. So we just shared some of the photographs from that series with them. And I did link to my dad's work earlier in this presentation on the slide about my personal story, but I'm not including that here. So one of the conversations that started in my classroom after sharing the work of Daniel Arzola was, I had a lot of students chiming in, as I mentioned. Students were really into that work. I had one 7th grade student who said something along the lines of, I totally support gay people and everything, but why do they always have to make such a big deal about being gay? In my head, and I'm like, I can handle this. I know exactly what to say. I know how to respond. And before I could say anything, hands started shooting up. So it was primarily a group of 8th grade girls in my class who said everything, and I also had some other students chime in, who said everything that I wanted to say or would have said and more. They called him on his use of the word they. They gave him some context, some more context by talking about the history of oppression, and they called out his privilege. And I checked in with the student as they were responding, making sure that there was understanding going on from both sides, and a lack of knowledge from him and some understandable defensiveness from the students that were speaking up. And so I checked in with the student at the end and said, does that make sense? Does that, considering the history, make sense? Can you see why people would be upset that you called all gay people they? And the student said, oh, I didn't think about it that way. Yeah, that makes sense. So this was a very easy conversation. It ended up being pretty easy, but it was really cool to see what happened when I didn't just step in and take over the conversation. And I really want to encourage you to let your students have this conversation without driving it and see what happens. And you're always there to chime in or steer things in a different direction if you need to. But I think our students have a lot of different perspectives and have a lot of knowledge, and it's just really cool. And there's a lot we can learn from them. So I think if you're able to stand back and let something play out, and if it's safe for everyone, then I recommend doing so. And here is a list of more middle school friendly queer artists. Some of these artists make work that's also appropriate for elementary school students. Some of these artists, just like the artists I shared before, not their entire bodies of work are not going to be appropriate for our school age children. That's up to you what you share with your students, but this is just a short list to get you started, and there are so many other amazing queer identifying artists out there. And then I wanted to include just a few more online resources. So these are all pretty comprehensive resources for educators, school administrators, parents, students. On all these websites, they have sections usually for all those groups of people. And so I've included LAUSD's Out for Safe Schools resources. Gender Spectrum's a really cool group that works to create gender inclusive environments for all children and teens. GLSEN has a bunch of different resources. The one that I referenced earlier is developing LGBTQ inclusive classroom, but they also have a little resource on working with LGBT students of color and a whole folder of educator resources, and then also resources that you can purchase. A lot of it's free, but they have some kits that you can purchase and bring to your school to help advocate. And then PFLAG has a guide to being a straight ally. I hope that I have shown you the importance and value in identifying yourself as an ally to not just your students, but also your coworkers. And when you do that, and when you're able to do that, it creates a safe space for your students, and it also creates a safe space for other faculty who identify with a community that you're showing support for. So I think that's really important. And I hope that you'll check out more of these resources, because there is absolutely no way that I covered even close to everything on this topic. It's also important, I think, to follow queer educators on social media. There are so many amazing free and paid resources out there that have already been created. And this is kind of a random list, and I did not check in with most of these people about sharing their profiles, and most of them probably don't know who I am. If I've included you on this list and you're watching this, sorry if that's weird. These are just accounts that I really respect and I think have a lot of good information for educators trying to make their classrooms a more inclusive space. And it's, once again, just a short list. So there are also a couple hashtags. They're not very popular hashtags, but they might lead you to some educators like Teach Pride and Queer Teacher. Thank you so much for joining me today. I hope I have shared something of value with you. You can always reach out to me over email or over Instagram. I'd love to know of lessons that you've used that have been successful, challenges you've run into, success stories, whatever. So please reach out and let's share and help each other in creating more inclusive spaces for our students. Thank you. If you have reached the end of this presentation and you are unconvinced that LGBTQIA+ individuals should have greater visibility in your curriculum, classroom, and in your school, I wanted to remind you that suicide is the second leading cause of death in youth aged 10 to 24. LGB youth are 3 times more likely to have contemplated suicide and 5 times more likely to have attempted it than their heterosexual peers, and the numbers are far more devastating for transgender youth. You can find these statistics and more information at thetrevorproject.org. I also want to remind you that you can have a lasting impact on your students by providing them opportunities to see themselves in the art and art history you share in your classroom, and by identifying yourself as an ally if you are prepared to be one.